It's 70s flashback week. I have my Art Deco chasuble on. It has a little bit of sentimentality to it for me. It's the chasuble I wore at the very first Christmas service that I ever celebrated at. And, you know, Easter is always a difficult time of year in terms of preaching, because for the same reason that Advent can be. It's that one of those readings is going to come out of Revelation. And I'm just going to leave it lay there. It's my practice to leave it lay there. Revelation has been the source of so much misunderstanding, so many bad ideas, so much bad doctrine. It's the reason that, for example, the Jehovah's Witnesses believe that only 144,000 people are going to get into heaven, because Revelation makes mention of that number, which is a symbolic number, and people don't understand it. It's the place from which the doctrine of the rapture sprang up within the last 200 years. And except for the fact that the language is very beautiful, and it's been used in a lot of our liturgies, I don't think there's a good reason to go there. Scholars have gone there and argued about what it means. I would just say that it is one vision that one person had about what not just heaven would look like, but what the meaning of all this is, expressed very much through the cultural lens of his time. So much so that we probably can't crawl inside that. So instead, rather than deal with that, I'd like to talk about exactly what's happening here between Jesus and Peter. And I'd also like to talk a little bit about what happened to Paul in the book of Acts. You know, the longer version of this reading from Acts includes him then being taken to a house owned by a man named Ananias, and the scales that occupy his eyes here that blind him eventually fall away. And his life does a complete 180. He goes from being a zealous first century Pharisee and persecutor of the early Christian movement into being arguably its most prolific preacher, and at least its most prolific preacher to the Gentiles of the time. He also, in an interesting sort of spin and turn of events, he also has spawned, through no fault of his own, a lot of really bad ideas in terms of doctrine, in terms of people grabbing onto him and wanting to literalize his view of the role of women in the church. And generally, to be fair to Paul, this has happened because in Paul we often have one side of a conversation. We're listening to Paul on the telephone, and he's talking to somebody about a situation, but we can't hear what they're saying. And so we're trying to take this one side of what Paul wrote and decide what he meant by it. Was he saying things about this moment in time? You know, was he, for example, if I was Paul, and somebody walked into church and they almost tripped because their shoes were untied, and I said, oh gee, you should make sure your shoes are tied before you come into church. Somebody would have grabbed onto that and made there a shoe tying ritual right outside the door, because they wouldn't have understand that Paul, me, was saying to somebody, oh gee, your shoe's untied, and decided instead that I was saying for all time everybody ought to check their shoes and retie them. So I think Paul gets a bad rap. And I think what's interesting in this particular passage from Acts is this radical life transformation that occurs. Speaking of radical life transformations, Peter's quite the character. It's interesting because if Peter was fishing, Peter's no longer in Jerusalem. They didn't know where to go fishing in Jerusalem. They were fishing in their professional boats, which were in the Galilee, which was, I always like to compare it, if Milwaukee was Jerusalem, somewhere around Oshkosh would be Lake Winnebago would be the Galilee. And so they'd gone back up there. Obviously, this didn't happen 2 days after the resurrection, because you don't walk, well, maybe you could, I couldn't walk from here to Oshkosh in about a day. It was a trip. And for observant Jews, which these folks still were, sometimes they chose to take a very sort of scenic route to avoid Samaria and becoming ritually unclean. And the apostles were not yet there about whether you had to be Jewish to be Christian. So they may well have done that. And they're out fishing in the Galilee, and they're in their professional fishing boat, which really, I've seen a reconstruction of a professional fishing boat. It would almost fit in this room. A little bit longer, maybe half again as long. But not what we think of as, you know, big lobster boats or anything. They were like oversized rowboats. And it was hot work. And so you might wonder, why is Peter running around naked in the boat fishing, so that when Jesus calls to them from shore, he has to put some clothes on? What they would do typically is strip down to their loincloth. And they fished overnight because, as any fisherman today knows, the fish bite better after dark. And he was there with, he had basically, I should say, returned to the life he lived before he became a follower of Jesus. Which means, and it wasn't just him, it was James and John, and it was all the disciples. Which means that they thought it was done. Which means that despite the fact that some people believe, and I don't want to jump into Pentecost, but you know, in Pentecost they're all in the upper room. So it's easy to think that that came like 2 days later, but it didn't, obviously, because we even stretch it out liturgically. They're in Jerusalem, Jesus is killed, he's raised, but they don't know what's going on. They say, let's go back to work. And they had nothing else to do. They go back home and they go to work. Peter now having been the one who's denied Jesus 3 times. And as our colleague, the Reverend Susan Gaines in Austin, Texas, likes to ask, who are you at the crucifixion? Or even before the crucifixion, with the arrest and the trial? Are you Mary standing at the foot of the cross? Or are you Peter and almost all the others, except arguably John, but we're not even so sure about that, running away? If you're with Jesus, and especially since they obviously haven't understood the full implications of what's happened, would you stand up and be arrested with him or not? Now, if you'll remember Columbine, probably a decade ago now almost, there was one girl, I think her name was Cassie, who, the story goes, although there's some questioning now about the veracity of the story, that she was asked if she was a Christian, and she said yes, and they shot her. That would be doing not what Peter did, following Jesus and not denying what he knew. Is that what God wants? We've been told that. Never deny your faith. But watch what happens here. Remember, Jesus said to Peter on Maundy Thursday, right before he was arrested, I tell you truly, before the rooster crows twice, depending on the gospel, you will deny me 3 times.